problem with your computer, do you throw it to the side and forget about it, get a new one? Or would you try to explore your options and how to fix it? This is the issue facing our criminal justice system. The debate is rehabilitation versus retribution. Rehabilitation in the prison system means creating more programs focused on jobs, health, and social skills in order to better reintegrate the inmates into society after release from prison. Criminals have an impact on all of our lives because they are part of our community that we live in. Professor Rodarte of Cal State Bakersfield states that we all want to live in a place where we feel safe and comfortable, but that can't be done unless inmates being released are the same person that they are coming out of prison as they were going into it. After extensive research, I concluded that rehabilitation should be valued above retribution in criminal justice systems because it reduces reoffender rates, decreases taxpayer money, and boosts the economy. The National Institute of Justice reports that over 58% of released inmates are reincarcerated within 5 years of being released. This is due to U.S. prisons valuing punishment over rehabilitation. Studies have shown that rehabilitative programs reduce the recidivism rate. Recidivism means the amount of people that go back into prison after being released. Programs include educational opportunity, job training programs, and drug and addiction, getting over drug and addiction problems. According to psychologist Dr. Simoneau, programs like these help to rebuild the lives of inmates outside of prison, which in turn helps them stay out of prison. Joan Aborn, a student at Stanford, did a research paper on government spending in the prison system and discovered that in California alone, taxpayers spend roughly $43,000 annually to house each inmate in prison. And of those thousands of dollars that we spend, only 5% gets put towards rehabilitation programs. However, putting up more money towards these programs will actually help to decrease taxpayer money overall. A study done by University of Pennsylvania shows that rehab programs decrease recidivism rates. So, if the amount of people returning to prisons decreases, that means it lessens the prison population, which means that we don't have to spend as much money for operation systems, which in turn decreases taxpayer money. As stated before, rehab programs decrease the likelihood that inmates will return to prison. According to the American Psychological Association, this allows ex-convicts to contribute and give back to the community, which in turn boosts our economy. Inmates go through job training programs which aid them in finding and keeping a job once they come out of prison. Writer James Gilligan of the New York Times states that releasing inmates ready to jump into the workforce creates more money and productivity in our economy.
Okay, imagine yourself in a few years or a while and you have a family. You might have a daughter that you're going to send away to college. Now imagine while she's at college, one night she goes to a party and is raped behind a dumpster by an unknown man while completely unconscious. This isn't a fairy tale. This is something that really happened. And the offender only received 3 months in prison, although he was recommended 6 years. This is a clear example. This is Brock Turner, the man that committed the crime. This is a clear example of where retribution was not properly given to a criminal for the offense he committed. Many of you may not have been personally or know someone who has been affected by the criminal justice system, but the odds are that in the future you will run into a problem where you will need to rely on it. So it's important to know what affects the sentencing that happens. After doing research, I have concluded that retribution should continue to be valued over rehabilitation in order to ensure equality in prosecution and to preserve victims' right to justice. Now, retribution ensures equality and consistency in its sentencing. In an article, Citizens' Sense of Judgment and the Legal System by Darley, People think of criminal conduct as immoral conduct. So if the law criminalizes an action that people do not think as immoral, it loses credibility. This shows that if there's not a clear, consistent prosecution, the criminal justice system loses efficacy, and people no longer feel safe in a system that won't. People no longer feel safe in a system that won't justify or serve justice to the wrong that was committed on them. Retribution is able to provide this consistency and equality in its sentencing through guidelines. The retribution system has many guidelines that lay out what's the minimum prison sentence for certain types of crimes. So it's like a petty theft would have a lot less sentence than like a murder or a rape case. In an article in the Australian Journal of Psychology by Gromit and Darley, retributivists are committed to ensuring that punishment is proportionate to the severity of the crime. This shows that there is a clear attempt to have consistency and equality in the sentencing. This is in contrast to rehabilitation, where perspective taking and subjectivity is taken into account way more often. In a study by Van Prugian and Kaufeng, the perspective taking is put to the test. In the study, there are two scenarios. The scenarios are exactly the same, except in one scenario, the man that committed the offense name was Alex, a typical white name, whereas in the other scenario, the man's name was Ahmed, which is a typical Moroccan name. The two groups that were judging whether or not the men were innocent or the severity of the punishment they chose were told, one group was told to take the man's perspective and then judge him. The other group was told to be as objective as possible and not take any perspectives or subjectivity during it. As you can see, the perspective group judged Ahmed a lot harsher than they would have if they would have been objective, whereas they judged Alex a lot less than they would have if they would have been objective. This study shows that in the specific context of punishing offenders, perspective taking may increase racial bias. This shows that we should not take perspectives and be as objective as possible and continue with the retribution system. Not only does this benefit the offenders as it creates consistency and equality, but it also helps the victims too by giving them the right to justice. The justice system's main purpose is to right the wrongs that have been committed against victims. In an article by David and Choi, Getting Even or Getting Equal, the victim of crime is humiliated and downgraded to a social position that is lower than he or she would normally have expected. This shows that there creates an imbalance that needs to be fixed between the offender and the victim. The solution to this is retributive punishment. An article called Rethinking the Restorative Retributive Dichotomy by Armstrong states that punishment restores the equilibrium between the victim and the offender which has been violated by the offense. This shows that it's necessary to have a punishment so that a victim feels that the wrong that was done against them has been justice has been served. This is furthered by the victims' right movement, where victims have been receiving more and more rights. For example, they receive the right to a quick and speedy trial. They receive the right to know when their offender has been released from jail or if they have escaped. And most importantly, they receive the right to justice. In another article, Retribution and Restoration as General Orientations Toward Justice, Wenzel and others suggest that victims' view of justice is likely to determine their preferences for and satisfaction with responses to injustice. This shows that for many victims, it's their belief of their satisfaction with the sentencing that was taken relies on the punishment that their offender received. Having a retribution system also may reduce the trauma that victims experience later on. In another study by Strelin and colleagues, they created three different groups that were given a scenario where a crime was committed against them. In one group, they were not able to give any punishment to the offender. In another group, punishment that they proposed was considered but not necessarily taken action. While the third group, the punishment that they chose for the offender was certainly given. And as you can see, the certain punishment had much higher levels of forgiveness and justice restoration than no punishment. So the retribution process has much higher victim satisfaction and therefore is better than the rehabilitation process.
The basic idea of rehabilitation through retribution is that a person who has been incarcerated will never be sent back to prison because of how impacted the prison was for them. So the idea is that it's hoped that an inmate's experience while locked up will leave a lasting impression for them to do whatever it takes to not go back to prison and receive a second term. Unfortunately, research has consistently shown that this is not how it plays out. Time spent in prison does not successfully rehabilitate most inmates, and the majority of criminals return to a life of crime almost immediately. Yes, a retribution system should be implemented. However, if you don't put an effort to fix your computer, it will always be broken.
Although the rehabilitation system boasts of many benefits of both monetary and in recidivism rates, the retribution system still remains the most important way to go. For the money benefits, money should not outweigh safety. So we should not be focusing on how much money we would save by taking prisoners out of jail and focus more on the safety of our children or our families. Another problem with the rehabilitation process is that it is a relatively new theory, and the reduced recidivism rates data is not complete. As an excerpt titled "The Return of Retribution" states, we know too little about human behavior to be able to rehabilitate individuals on a routine basis, or even to determine accurately whether or when a particular prisoner has been rehabilitated. As this quote says, there's no guarantee that the prisoners we say are rehabilitated will actually become safe members of society again.
Although creating rehabilitation programs is a difficult process to implement, bigger strides to improve public safety will be made through prisoner rehabilitation. Not only will rehabilitation promote public safety through lower recidivism rates, but it also has great economic benefits.
Our country should continue to incorporate retribution system in our criminal justice system in order to maintain equality and victims' rights. In this way, retribution system should triumph over the rehabilitation system.